Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. East China Sea, Asia. This is a moment you need a deal of analysis to understand the game. The game is chess, the game is checkers, the game is go. We can use metaphors. But there is clearly a game afoot between significant world powers using weapons of conflict to talk to each other about diplomatic confrontation. I'm looking at China, Japan. Also involved in this is Korea and Australia and the whole of the East Asian operating states dealing with the rising power of China, the peaceful rising power of China. Over these many months, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com joins me here. Gordon and I have been pointing to the uninhabited Senkaku Islands. In these last days, there have been a series of moments that it's necessary to understand how they connect and where we're going, because this is the beginning of a drama. On Saturday, East Coast time, the Chinese military, People's Liberation Army, and the Navy and the Air Force declared a zone that is in conflict with an air defense zone of Japan and also of Korea. Also, we're dealing with Taiwan. That creates a conflict over the East China Sea. The response to that was protest, but then on Tuesday East Coast time, watch this because we're dealing with a dateline, the Americans answered by sending B-52s through that defense zone, that air defense zone. Gordon, a very good evening to you. I hope I've laid out the facts correctly, and we're in a moment to go to Hong Kong. But do you see this conflict right now as state to state and leader to leader? Xi Jinping, the new boss, responding to President Obama, responding to Prime Minister Abe. Is this at the leader of state level?
Well, certainly, John. But in China, the interesting question is this the People's Liberation Army driving policy, or is it Xi Jinping, the president and the general secretary of the Communist Party? It very well may be that the generals and the admirals are driving the bus and that Xi Jinping is just sort of watching this occur. Many people disagree about who's in charge of whom, but it is a fascinating story.
Scott Harold, the associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation, joins us from Hong Kong, which is in this threat area. And so Scott is seeing this in real time during the daytime when he is responding to the news. Scott, thanks for joining us. Very quickly, your analysis right now, is this the beginning stages? We don't need to go to the metaphor of a go game, but the beginning stages, and do you expect escalation? Good morning, Scott.
Good evening, John, and good evening, Gordon. No, I would submit to you, John, that we are not at the beginning stages. We are deep in the heart of a rather long-standing Chinese effort to coerce Japan into reaching the negotiating table, whereby China's pressure on Japan would force Tokyo to agree to negotiate away the status of the Senkaku Islands. And so this so-called air defense identification zone that China has thrown up that encompasses parts of the East China Sea, including the Senkakus, and overlapping with those of both Korea and Japan, is part of a strategy that goes back at least to 2010, when they began to really flood the zone with paramilitary and fishing vessels, when they have flown drones through the region, when they have begun sending their Fisheries Law Enforcement Command and State Oceanographic Administration vessels into the region to make the claim that we regularly patrol here and therefore this is our legitimate waters. And so I think that we're actually in the game, and it behooves all of us who are paying attention to this to realize that this is not a one-off. This is a part of a long-term coordinated strategy. I don't think the idea that this is coming from some general somewhere in the PLA, but rather this is a part of a long-term strategy that we can trace very clearly back to the aftermath of, say, the period around the Olympics in the early 2010s.
Scott, when China established its air defense identification zone on Saturday, it overlapped with sovereign Japanese airspace and sovereign South Korean airspace, and therefore was particularly provocative. What was interesting was that the U.S. Air Force flew through China's new self-declared zone and purposely ignored Chinese rules, which required the B-52s to get into contact with the Chinese authorities to maintain certain transponder frequencies, file flight plans, all the rest of it. We did nothing of that. Also very interesting is that yesterday, our time, the White House described China's establishment of the zone as inflammatory, which is extraordinarily harsh language that we have not heard from the Obama administration. My question to you is, where did this new or apparently new policy come from? Did it come from the Pentagon? Did it come from the White House? Or is there just a general view in Washington now that we've sort of hit a tipping point and that there should be at least a different approach to China?
It's an excellent question, Gordon. Unfortunately, I don't have line into the exact thinking of the different branches of government, but what I can say is if you look at the timing, both Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel, the two Secretaries of State and Defense, released very similar, very strongly worded, appropriately strongly worded statements in the immediate aftermath of China's actions. And from where I sit and my perception of how people in Washington are responding from people I do talk to as well as things I'm reading, it looks to me like, yes, we are at something of an inflection point. I don't think there's much daylight between the different departments, and I certainly believe that the administration has adopted a policy that it itself is supportive of. It's not the State or Defense Departments initiating something that the President doesn't agree with. I think that there's a widespread recognition that this is a step that challenges fundamentally the basic stability of the Asia-Pacific and our interests as well as those of our treaty allies.
What I think is fascinating about all of this is that now that the United States has blatantly ignored the establishment of the zone, we're starting to see the Japanese do the same thing. The question is, how do you think the Chinese are going to respond? Are they going to say that this is the last word? Are they just going to accept this? Or are they going to do something to counter the overflight of the B-52s and what the Japanese are now doing in the last couple days?
In other words, are they going to escalate, Scott?
I think it would behoove all of us looking at this to anticipate that China has not undertaken an action for which it anticipates that it will accept humiliation. Even if they have taken an action that we deem to be provocative, foolhardy, dangerous, appalling, nonetheless, I fully expect that they have thought through this enough to know that if they're completely ignored, then they will lose more than just face, they will lose influence. And so I would expect that they will do something.
Let me press
Where
you, Scott.
that response will come, it's not entirely clear, but Japan at least has convinced its civilian airlines not to accept this, and the South Koreans have also done the same. Australia, as you noted, called in the Chinese ambassador. So there's really a bit of a strong pushback on this.
Scott, quickly, the timing of this. At the same time in Geneva, all the world powers were focused on Iran and the suspect nuclear weapons program, and the Chinese move. Coincidence?
You know, it's tough to say coincidence, but sometimes I think things can be coincidental, John. I suspect that they had been planning this for quite a while. I don't think this was something they did just because they realized, oh, the Americans just got a big breakthrough on Iran, so let's do something big to offset that. On the other hand, could they have done this the following weekend, i.e. 3 or 4 days from now instead of last weekend? Certainly. But what it gains them to try to offset the Iran issue or distract from Iran by refocusing people's attention in Asia is not entirely clear to me. Moreover, these don't seem to be, the Iran issue is largely a diplomatic issue, and this is largely an area where the PLA and the Central Military Commission would be working with the top leadership. So,
Scott Harold is Associate Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation. He's in Hong Kong. Gordon Chang of Forbes.com will speak much of this moment throughout the evening. I'm John Batchelor.